She was the only woman who could make the Empress tremble. But they didn't kill her with a blade, they killed her with a shadow. Dragged into the filth and steam of the palace slave quarters, she was stripped of her name and her colors. But inside those walls, she was hiding something the empire was desperate to erase. It wasn't just a political scandal. It was a secret so dangerous that it forced the law itself to become a weapon. What did she hide in those quarters? Today, we reveal the forbidden truth the empire tried to bury. The dirtiest secret of the imperial household. They wanted to make her disappear not with a single dramatic stroke, but with months and years of procedure, denial, and the steady strangling of everything that made her someone. Hidden now among the steam and filth of the palace slave quarters, the woman who had once stood in the public square, whose voice had drawn crowds and whose colors had been feared by an empress, had become a figure reduced to a sheltering garment and a name that others tried to erase. What did she hide in those quarters? The answer is less scandal than a secret the empire preferred never to name, the way power weaponizes the everyday to dissolve a person. This is a fictionalized account inspired by historical themes. Names and places have been adapted. She had not been born to exceptional rank. Her rise was the product of a rare mixture, a persuasive public presence, an uncanny ability to crystallize popular grievances, and a set of ceremonial acts that recharged old loyalties in a fragile polity. In season after season, she moved through the empire's forums and processions, sometimes at the side of an opposing faction, sometimes defying the Empress herself with a single, well-timed gesture that suggested a different source of legitimacy. For some, she was a leader of the hopeful. For those in power, she was an existential threat, not because of armies she commanded, but because she carried a story people wanted to believe. When the balance of power shifted, fast, almost surgically, her authority had to be neutralized. To kill a living symbol carried political risks. A martyr might rise. To imprison her in a formal prison would leave her visible. The occupiers chose another path. She was seized in a raid that, in the official account, was a lawful arrest. Witnesses later described coercion, betrayal by a supposed ally, and hurried marches across the city at dusk. What followed was not merely confinement, but a legal choreography designed to strip the markers of personhood one by one. They sold her into the slave quarter of the imperial household. The space itself deserves description for the barbarism of its ordinariness. A cluster of low rooms and narrow corridors tucked beneath the palace proper, where light fought in through small high windows, where the smell of unwashed cloth and cook's oils mingled with the sourness of overcrowded bodies, where the clang of chains and the rattle of keys were the day's percussion. The quarter was a liminal place, near enough to the court to be policed, far enough to be obscured from public scrutiny. There she would be visible to those who entered, but invisible to most of the city's conscience. She arrived stripped of insignia and escorted by men who had once given her orders and now gave orders over her. The guards were instructed that she must be watched constantly. They were also told, imperially, that she was to be denied certain protections that elsewhere might have been afforded as customary: the presence of female attendants, access to counsel of her choosing, and, crucially, any cleric she or her supporters might name. Those denials were not random cruelty. They were calculated to sever her from the rituals and relationships that sustained identity in a society where rank, prayer, and dress coalesced into a public self. It is here that garments become more than clothing. They become testimony and strategy. Within 2 days of her arrival, she made a practical decision. She exchanged some of the coarse slave tunics she was forced to wear for a different set of clothes, simple, tightly cut garments of a masculine cut taken from the quarter's supplies. According to later testimony offered by an attendant, she said simply, "They will not touch me wearing these. They look less like a prize and more like a worker." That sentence, brief and tactical, would later be dressed into a different story by the tribunal. Proof of deception, proof of an intent to masquerade. Why would a garment protect her? The slave quarters' intimacy with the palace meant that the men who patrolled it had a particular sort of authority, privileged access, rough familiarity, and predispositions forged by rank. For many women in the quarter, being seen as feminine, as a marked figure, invited humiliation and assault. Masculine clothes might not stop every attack, but they could shift perceptions, reduce catcalls, discourage opportunistic violence. For her, who still carried a memory of public roles and of followers, the clothes were also an attempt to move through danger without spectacle. That act of tactical self-preservation, practical, unromantic, would be reframed as evidence of intent when the instruments of law required proof. Inside the quarter, the daily ordeals were organized to erode her inward life. Guards mocked her in shifts. On some nights she was allowed to keep only a single candle. On others she was placed in a cell where talk was punished by chains tightened for hours. Requests for a named clergyman were refused on the grounds that no outside clergy may enter the imperial household without express leave. When she asked for female attendants, women who could help with basic hygiene and who could be trusted companions, the petition was delayed, dismissed, or answered with men assigned to oversee whatever minimal handwork she might perform. The record shows different accounts of the degree of physical abuse she suffered, where some witnesses report attempted assaults and others claim only threats and taunts. The common thread is procedural denial. The way's institutional rules about who may enter, who may attend, who may be present, were turned into a suffocating apparatus. The legal theater that followed took those daily indignities and transcribed them into evidence. The occupying authority convened a tribunal ostensibly to determine two things: whether she propagated rebellion in word and deed, and whether her conduct violated the empire's moral and legal codes. That tribunal was not an open, regular court. It was a staged process, its venue chosen for convenience to the authorities, and its procedures tailored to facilitate a predetermined outcome. Records, kept in varying copies and languages, indicate a pattern. The tribunal repeatedly rejected requests for witnesses to appear, deferred pleas for counsel of the accused's choosing, and permitted leading questions that shaped answers rather than drew them out. Observers and later commissions would note a crucial document in the proceedings: an abjuration, a formal signed renunciation of certain claims and behaviors that the tribunal presented as voluntary. Where the abjuration was supposed to represent an act of conscience, several sources later asserted it had been procured under duress. A clerk's note in one surviving dossier records that she was brought before the assembly after days of isolation. An attendant's deposition, given years later, says she was worn thin, uncertain whether the next sleep would be a sleep broken by whips or by forgetting. That phrase, worn thin, captures the slow cruelty no sudden death could accomplish, the wearing down of refusal. On paper the abjuration was clear: an explicit relinquishment of visionary claims, a promise to abandon certain public pretensions, and a renunciation of the clothing and regalia associated with the persona she had once held. The language in the signed page is formal and legalistic. In the transcript, it reads like any number of such documents used by courts to signal repentance. But the context matters. The tribunal was a place where absence of advocacy counted as presence of guilt, where solitude and deprivation could be framed as inner change. The critical question for later historians, and for any fair accounting, is whether the words on the page were written by a determined conscience or by a frightened hand pressed by a throttle of continuous pressure. Sources differ, and we must let that difference stand. Released back into the slave quarter after the abjuration, she confronted the cruel bargain she had been forced to make. The quarter was not a place in which an oath had the power to change circumstances. The same men who had escorted her to the tribunal continued to patrol her room. She had renounced certain claims on paper. She had not renounced the needs that made her human: safety, modesty, spiritual consolation. Within days she returned to the masculine garments that had sheltered her from immediate violation. To her, the clothing was not theatrical rebellion, but a necessary tactic to survive the hands of her watchers. To the tribunal it became incontrovertible evidence of relapse. The legal category the court deployed, relapse, merited a specific treatment under the law of the occupying authority. A person who had abjured and then returned to the prescribed behavior was no longer a penitential subject, but a recalcitrant one, and thus removable to secular punishment. The tribunal's framing was neat in its cruelty. The procedure itself had manufactured the condition it declared illicit. The abjuration made her vulnerable. The vulnerability forced the practical choice to save one's body. The practical choice was then used as legal proof of wrongdoing. It is a pattern that repeats in histories of political repression. The law does not simply punish acts, it shapes acts by removing choices and then punishes the responses. Before the final delivery to secular authority, there were attempts at concealment and at sanitizing what would follow. Orders for the punishment were couched in technical language, to be delivered to the secular hand for execution of sentence. The record is careful to separate the tribunal's technical finding from the spectacle of punishment, an attempt perhaps to retain a veneer of institutional propriety. Those who escorted her to the place of sentence spoke later of a small convoy moving through early light, of the deliberate absence of a public announcement, and of measures taken to prevent crowds who might transform punishment into a spectacle of sympathy. What happened at the scene of secular punishment is recorded in fragments and in testimony that must be handled with care. Some witnesses later said the execution took the form of burning. Others report exile, or an attempt to disfigure and scatter remains. Where specifics diverge, the symbolic core remains consistent, an effort to remove any physical locus around which a memory might gather. The authorities feared relics. They feared that what remained of a body could become a focal point for commemoration and dissent. So the machinery of erasure was as important as the act itself. To strip, to burn, to scatter, these are gestures of finality, but they were preceded by a longer, intentional process of dispossession. If the Empire's intent was to erase, the effect was more complicated. Stories can survive in the mouths of those who were nearby. Attendants, fellow captives, servants who had been ordered to perform tasks and kept private their memories for fear of reprisal. Years after the event, as regimes changed and the Empire's control loosened in pockets, those recollections resurfaced. A later commission, convened by a different authority in a period when the political calculus favored reassessment, collected depositions. It catalogued discrepancies and pointed to procedural irregularities: denial of counsel, the atmosphere of coercion around the abjuration, the refusal to allow ecclesiastical consolation. The Commission's report is not a simple vindication. It is, however, a corrective. Where the original tribunal read a single act as proof of duplicity, the Commission saw a line of calculated steps that removed her agency and then cited her choices as voluntary failures. There is a complicating name in the administration of her trial. Several surviving copies of the tribunal's register spell a bishop's name as Pierre Cossong. Historians who have examined the documents note that the form is anomalous, and some suggest it may be a corrupted form of a better-known official name, perhaps an administrative equivalent to Pierre Cochon in other records, yet the uncertainty remains. Where the name cannot be confirmed, scholars mark it as indefinido and caution against treating the figure with the certainty of better documented actors. What redeems memory is not only the Commission's technical findings, but the persistence of narratives gathered in private rooms and scattered notes, small artifacts of human resistance. One attendant's late deposition, classified in the Commission files as later testimony, reads, "She did not ask to be sung to death. She asked simply to be named, to be let to a cleric so she might pray in the way she had been taught." The language is prosaic. Its power is the ordinariness of the request. The Empire had not merely taken a life, it had taken opportunities for ordinary rituals of consolation. Out of that quiet accumulation of testimony grew a memory that outlived the Empire's attempt at obliteration. The very measures aimed at preventing public commemoration, secret executions, scattering of remains, a deliberate lack of official record, suggested to later generations that the regime feared what she had represented. Over time, stories hardened into hagiography for some and into cautionary tales for others. The law, which had been used as an instrument of political neutralization, later stood indicted for its procedural abuses. Rehabilitation, where it came, was partial. It could not restore years spent hidden in filth, nor could it entirely repair the reputational damage the tribunal had wrought. Yet the act of revisiting records and collecting evidence reinserted her into a public conversation she had been denied while alive. There is a particular cruelty to the strategy of protracted humiliation. A single execution is a moment people can resist or transform. A long series of small, legally rationalized degradations is harder to name and to oppose. The law provides cover. It cites codes, recites formalities, reads like neutral machinery. But when the machinery is calibrated to deny companions, to forbid spiritual counsel, to insist that clothes be a matter of proof rather than protection, it becomes an instrument of erasure under the guise of order. The Empire's dirtiest secret, then, is not simply that it executed or punished. It is that it institutionalized the slow shrinking of a person's world, making death seem like only the end note of a longer policy of dehumanization. There is an ethical question threaded through the story that refuses to be answered by legal niceties. Which is the worst crime, the single spectacular death, or the long deprivation of identity, voice, and ritual? The tribunal framed its work as a defense of social order. The commission that followed framed its work as a correction of miscarriages. But the human measure lies elsewhere. A living person denied the ability to pray, to speak with those they trust, to dress according to a necessity rather than a theatrical sign. That person experiences a steady, compounding injury. It is a cruelty that can be performed in the daylight of official seals and in the dark of a slave quarters corner where no one will write down what happened. Institutions make that cruelty legible by paper and handshake, and then try to bury it under the paper after the fact. This is not to say the story is uncomplicated. The sources we rely on diverge. Some contemporaneous registers depict a woman who expressed doubt, who asked for mercy. Some later depositions read like acts of loyalty, attendants who remembered whispered blessings, and the tending of wounds that may or may not have been visible to a tribunal clerk. We must not transform uncertainty into certainty. Instead, we must accept the moral texture of ambiguity and still render a judgment about procedure. The lesson is institutional, not rhetorical. When legal forms are allowed to substitute for humane practice, when rituals of law replace rituals of care, power has found a way to commit slow violence with public approval. If the final indignity was meant to make memory impossible, it succeeded only for a while. The scattered testimonies gathered after the political winds changed exposed the pattern. An occupying authority that weaponized routine forms, denial of counsel, refusal of clergy, interpretation of clothing as guilt, pulled a life apart without ever having to perform a single, dramatic extravagance in public. In the later commission's language, the error was procedural, a euphemism for what witnesses called oppression. There is another afterlife to consider, how a figure like the Empress's rival becomes a symbol, and how symbols are themselves contested. For some, she became a martyr in the classic sense, a person killed because she stood against power. For others, her story is a cautionary tale about the seductions of charisma and the dangers of public personae. Both readings can coexist because the political meaning of a life is always contested. Yet the core moral remains, an institutional process that systematically removes a person's supports, companions, counsel, clothing that ensures safety, bears responsibility for the outcome irrespective of how the laws are written. This is not a tale of singular villainy so much as of banal mechanisms. It should trouble us that the instruments of normal governance, tribunals, clerical permissions, custodial protocols, can be retooled into instruments of annihilation. The slave quarters where she hid the truth also hide a much more uncomfortable truth about public life. That cruelty is often dressed as administration. There is a last irony. The more vigorously the empire tried to tidy up its crimes, by hiding registers, by spelling names in odd forms, by dispersing relics, the more the small traces persisted. A smudged note about a denied request, an attendant's line about a sweater borrowed in the night, a cleric's memory of a prayer muttered in the dark. Those fragments were unattractive to power because they were untheatrical. But when assembled later, they told a deeper story than any single dramatic charge could. A life dismantled across time by procedures normalized into law. So what did she hide in the slave quarters? She hid a life that could not be fully erased. The choices she made in the cramped calculus of survival, the garments that protected her from immediate violence, and later became the grounds for legal condemnation. The private acts of devotion, denied to her by those who feared the power of her public persona. And more than that, she hid a lesson. The empire's dirtiest secret was not an isolated act to be excoriated and forgotten, but a systemic pattern, an architectural cruelty enacted through clerks, keys, petitions refused, and forms signed. To conclude, institutions endure beyond a single ruler, and the moral task of society is to design them so they refuse to be instruments of private vendettas. The story of the Empress's rival is a reminder that law made without humanity becomes a tool for the slow strangling of personhood. If this account has unsettled you, consider what procedures today, how a file is closed, how a petition is delayed, how a person is denied counsel or solace, might be weaponized tomorrow. The real secret the empire tried to keep was not who lived and who died, but the small, repeatable acts that together make disappearance possible. If this story moved you, subscribe and watch our next deep dive into the retrial and the primary sources behind this case.